Hey everybody, Abraham here. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about compost. So, to begin with, what compost is basically food waste and yard waste, just organic material that's used and broken down to provide nutrients as a supplement for your soil. So it gives your soil a bunch of nutrients that are really good for your plants. And the way you make compost is basically just use like your food scraps, you use your lawn clippings, and like eggshells, stuff that you know, food waste, and you basically just mix them together, and it turns into really good food for your plants. So something that's really good about compost is it introduces microorganisms into your soil. Now the reason that's super good is that because it helps aerate your soil, which means that your soil is able to breathe and able to get nutrients all over rather than in just a thin spot. And it also helps break down organic material. The reason that's important is because your plant can't just go ahead and turn eggshells into plant food. It needs those microorganisms to break down that eggshell into carbon in order to into nitrogen. Eggshells have nitrogen. Break down the eggshells into nitrogen in order to have the plants actually use them as food. So when we're creating compost, we divide up the ingredients for our compost into two different types of things. Into green materials, green ingredients, and brown materials. So the green materials will provide the soil, the compost, with nitrogen, whereas the brown materials are going to provide the soil with some much needed carbon. So some examples of green materials, which, as I said, contain nitrogen, are your fruit and vegetable scraps, coffee grounds and tea bags, eggshells, a lot of stuff that comes out of the kitchen, basically. Your brown materials are stuff that will generally compose of lawn clippings. So there'll be like dry leaves, wood chips, wood trimmings. So you could also use paper, but you have to make sure it's shredded. If it's too much paper, it'll just get clumpy and it won't compose very quickly. It'll take a lot of time. Same thing with sawdust. If you use sawdust, which is something you can use, you want to make sure that it's used with untreated wood. Otherwise, you're putting a bunch of chemicals into your compost, and you're going to want to make sure it gets spread out, because if it gets too clumpy, it's not breaking down quickly enough and could actually get moldy. A few things to consider about compost is you don't want to put any infected plants in there. So if there's any diseased plants, you don't want to put them in your compost, because even though everything breaks down, the disease might stay in the compost, and you might just end up spreading it if you start off with a diseased compost pile. That also goes for weeds. You don't want to put weeds in your compost pile, especially if they're seeding, because if you got weed seeds in your compost pile and you spread that all around your garden will just get infested with weeds, and that's not really ideal, especially if you're trying to garden a bunch of foods. It'll make it so your job is a lot harder. A few things to consider. Oh, before I say that, let me that's something I just learned recently. Toilet paper rolls and paper towel rolls can actually be used in compost. So I would suggest that you throw those in there as well, rather than in the trash, because that way you could find use for them rather than putting them in a landfill. A few things that you never want in your compost are meat, bones, and fish scraps. All three of those attract pests, and it's best to just not put them in your compost. In addition to this, you don't want to do pet manure, and the reason for that is because a lot of the pet food, it just won't compose as well as the rest of it. Pet manure and animal manure composes, though at a different rate, and pet manure specifically, you don't want to turn your the food that we feed our pets is not ideal for compost. So don't put your pet manure in your compost pile. Finally, a few things that might surprise you that you don't want in your compost pile are banana peels, peach peels, and orange rinds. The reason you do not want to put those in your compost pile is because they're actually very often sprayed with some type of pesticide before shipping them off to the grocery store. And so you don't want those chemicals in your compost pile. It's best to just avoid them. So a tip I have for you, because I do want you to start your own compost pile, is to find a jar with a lid or some type of a container with a lid. And what I want you to do is from now on, rather than throwing food scraps, in the garbage, I want you to put your food scraps in this container. Try to keep track of your green materials versus your brown materials, but try to form your own compost. Once it gets filled up, take it outside. Maybe start a little area to plant some flowers or something. Or if you have a big garden already and a compost pile already set up, you could just add that over to the compost pile. In the material, in the description below, I'm gonna add a few other things that a few other tips regarding compost, as well as a list of green materials which contain nitrogen and brown materials which contain carbon, as well as a couple more tips I have for you. What I want you guys to do is get going on that compost. Take a look at those ingredients, the materials that in the description, and make sure you have everything you need for composting. And have fun. Let me know how it goes.